If you would like to set up your own VMs at home to practice the labs, I encourage that, and I'm going to show you how to get things going to where it is as close as possible to what we have in the classroom. But let's talk about a few things first. Server 2008 R2 is made for 64-bit hardware, so make sure your PC has 64-bit hardware. Also, virtualization needs to be turned on in your BIOS. We'll cover that in just a second. Make sure your computer has enough horsepower to run all these VMs at the same time without starving your host operating system out of resources. Hardware virtualization is a setting in your BIOS that may or may not be turned on by default. Depending on who made your BIOS, it could be under the security section, it could be under the advanced BIOS features. Look for something like virtualization technology or VTX or something like that. Make sure it is turned on. In class, we use Oracle VM VirtualBox to install and run our virtual machines. If you prefer some other application, that's fine. It will not be terribly difficult to translate my instructions to whatever application you choose. If you want to download Oracle VM VirtualBox, it is free. Just Google it, download the latest version, and install it on your computer. You'll need a copy of the operating systems, Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7. You can use DVDs if you want to, but I'll tell you right now, ISO files are much easier to work with. If you don't have ISO files, we have some on the classroom lab PCs. Bring a flash drive and copy them off. With that being said, let's get started installing our virtual machines. So I've copied the ISO or disk image files for Windows 7 and 2008 R2 to my computer and saved them in a location that I can remember real easy. I have also downloaded and installed Oracle VM VirtualBox, and as soon as you do that, you will get this icon on your desktop. Double click the icon and that will open Oracle VM VirtualBox. The goal here is to create a new virtual machine. So we're going to use this nice little new button up here in the top left corner, and that will open a small box and prompt us to give it a name. This is a friendly name that you can call whatever you want to. I'm going to call it Lab Practice 1, just like what we have in the classroom. The type here, Microsoft Windows, and the version, I'm going to choose 2008 64-bit. We're working with R2 here, so it only comes in 64-bit. Next on that, the recommended memory for 2008 R2 was 512. That happens to be the minimum. Well, I want a little bit more than minimum. I'm going to go ahead and set this at 1024. You might choose a different value based on how much memory is on your host computer. Just be mindful. Next on that, this is asking if we want to create a virtual hard drive. This is a file that the application sees as a hard disk. I do want to create one. Leave that at default and create. The default type of file here is VDI. I'm going to leave that there. And it next asks us if we want to dynamically allocate the size or if we want to make this a fixed size. The difference here is that a fixed size hard disk file, if I tell it 30 gigs, the fixed size will be a 30 gig file on my computer's hard drive. If I choose this first option, then the file will be very, very small and grow according to what I have stored in my virtual hard disk. And we'll show you that in just a few minutes. So I'm going to leave it at this first option here and press next. The name of the virtual disk file, I'm going to leave it at default, but I'm changing this 25 to a 30. I want a 30 gig hard drive. And I'm going to press create, and that will create a base virtual machine. Now, there are a few things I need to change about this machine before it's ready for our purposes. So I'm going to use this settings button here and make my changes to the VM. The first section I'm going to make changes in is the system section. If you look here, we have a boot order, very similar to what you have in your BIOS boot order. It will first look for boot files on a floppy disk. Well, we don't have a floppy disk, at least I don't. So I'm going to untick that. The next thing it looks for is boot files on a CD or a DVD, and finally the hard disk, which is perfectly okay for me. I am fine with that. So I'm going to leave the rest of that alone. And the next section I'm going to make changes to is in the storage section here. I want to call your attention to something very quickly. This is the hard disk file that we created during setup. This is what our virtual machine looks at as a hard disk. If we click on that, it will show us some specifics. The virtual size is 30 gigs, so the virtual operating system will see that as a 30 gigabyte hard disk. What's actually going on, though, you see the real size of it. It's only 2 megs. That's because we chose dynamically allocated. It's very, very small until we actually store something on the hard disk file. That will grow accordingly up to a max of 30 gigabytes. Up here, above that, we have our IDE controller. This is what the virtual machine looks at as a DVD or CD disk drive. If we click on that and look over here to the right, we will see a small icon representing a CD. Now, if we had an actual DVD inserted into our host machine's CD or DVD drive, we could tell our machine here to look at that drive for any content it could find in our CD drive. However, I don't. I have an ISO file that I would like the machine to look at as a DVD. So I'm going to choose a virtual CD or DVD disk file. Once I do that, I'm going to find where I stored my ISO files and choose the appropriate disk image file from what I have here. And this machine is going to be my 2008 R2 server. So I'm going to choose the disk image file that corresponds to that and press the open button. That will associate that disk image file with my virtual CD or DVD disk drive. Now, the last section I'm going to make changes to is in the network section. The default here is NAT. What that means is that the virtual machine can communicate on your host machine's network card. It can get out and communicate with other machines on your real live network. And that's okay if that's what you want. If you're working in a production environment and you want machines to actually communicate on the physical network. However, in our lab environment, we don't want that because that could cause some problems when we light up DHCP servers and start the broadcast for those things. That could cause problems with other people's machines. So we don't want that. What I'm going to do here is choose internal network. The way this works is any virtual machine that is on the same internal network can talk to each other. And the way we put them on the same internal network is we give them the same name, the same internal network name. I'm going to name this internal network Acme. So any other virtual machine that I put on the Acme internal network is essentially on the same virtual switch. So it's like each machine being plugged in to the same switch. And assuming the IP addressing is configured correctly on the operating system of that virtual machine, then they can talk to each other without problem. what they cannot do is get out onto the physical network or the internet. So that's something to keep in mind. Let's open the advanced section here. I'm just going to check over a few settings just to make sure it's what we need. It looks like it is. We don't have to mess with any of this stuff here, but I do want to make sure that cable connected is selected. Otherwise, the network card in the virtual machine would show that a cable is unplugged. So all this looks good now. A quick recap. I went over the boot order, made sure it was correct for me. In the storage section, I associated the ISO file to my virtual DVD drive. And in the network section, I chose internal network and the Acme name. Okay, we're going to press OK on this, and that will make this virtual machine ready for us to install our operating system. Now, you may have a few other machines to install depending on which class you are in. If you are in server 1, you will need to make another virtual machine representing our Windows 7 box, and it's the same exact settings. You might choose to use a smaller amount of memory for our Windows 7 box. That's okay. If you're in server 2, you will have to make another virtual machine for a second server and one more virtual machine for your Windows 7 box. And again, it's the same exact settings on the virtual machine as the first one we just created. So next time we're together, we will look at how to install the operating system.